When a novice of the cult Mechanicus begins the holy pilgrimage of augmentation, the galaxy expects a predictable sequence of sacrifices. They surrender the fragile organic eye for the precision of the optical mechadendrite. They amputate the trembling biological hand to embrace the cold, unyielding certainty of the blessed prosthetic. We are taught that the doctrine of the flesh is weak is a fundamentally physical critique of the human body. But true weakness is not found in the tearing of muscle or the breaking of bone. True weakness is the paralyzing, suffocating weight of the human heart when it is forced to process the apocalyptic horrors of the 41st millennium. The first weakness he amputated was grief. Today on Hakrift, we dissect the ultimate unspoken heresy of the Martian priesthood. We will explore the dark philosophy of a mid-tier Magos, who realized that the most vulnerable organ in the human body is not the lung or the liver. It is the capacity to feel. We will reveal how transhumanism was weaponized not as a pursuit of divine knowledge, but as the ultimate cowardly form of emotional escapism. To understand the profound psychological deviance of this specific tech priest, one must first analyze the standard trauma matrix of the Adeptus Mechanicus. A Magos of the Forge worlds does not live a sheltered life of quiet academic study. They are deployed to the front lines of galactic annihilation. They walk through the radioactive ashes of hive cities, cataloging the destroyed remnants of imperial war engines, while the billions of charred corpses beneath their metallic boots are simply recorded as collateral data. For a baseline human mind, this level of constant, unrelenting exposure to mass death is a psychological corrosive. It generates severe post-traumatic stress, crippling empathy, and the agonizing, inescapable sensation of profound grief. The standard imperial citizen copes through blind, weeping faith in the God Emperor. The Adeptus Mechanicus, however, views coping mechanisms as highly inefficient. While his peers began their holy ordinations by replacing their vocal cords to better chant the binary litanies, this particular adept identified a far more urgent biological flaw. He looked at his own trembling hands after witnessing the planetary scale execution of a rebellious colony and realized that his hands were not shaking because they lacked muscular density. They were shaking because his neurochemical pathways were being flooded with cortisol, adrenaline, and an overwhelming illogical sorrow for the dead. He recognized that as long as he possessed an amygdala that could process horror and an endocrine system that could secrete the chemical markers of despair, his logic, engines would forever be compromised by the static of human empathy. He did not need a stronger arm to hold a weapon. He needed a sterilized mind to pull the trigger without hesitation. Thus, he did not hide his intentions. He embraced the highest, most revered sacrament of his order. He knelt before the surgical altars of the Forge to undergo the rite of pure thought. To the cult Mechanicus, this is the ultimate act of holy devotion, the literal surgical excision of the brain's right hemisphere, replacing the creative, emotional flesh with a flawless, crystalline cogitator. His peers gathered to chant hymns of binary praise, watching in awe as they believed he was ascending to the pure, unclouded logic of the Omnissiah. But beneath the sacred incense and the holy oils lay a pathetic, cowardly truth. He did not undertake this irreversible self-mutilation to move closer to God. He did it because he was terrified. He utilized the holy rite to systematically sever the neural pathways responsible for processing emotional distress, physically deleting the chemical receptors for empathy and pity. When the cranial saws finally stopped spinning and his cranium was resealed with a blessed adamantium plate, he awoke not as an enlightened saint of the machine, but as a perfectly localized emotional void. The immediate aftermath of this neural amputation was a terrifying display of absolute chilling efficiency. He was deployed to a quarantine sector where a necrotic plague was actively dissolving the civilian population. A normal human commander would be paralyzed by the shrieks of the dying, their judgment clouded by the desperate moral imperative to save lives. The newly modified tech priest walked through the screaming wards with the placid, undisturbed tranquility of a man strolling through an empty museum. He did not feel disgust. He did not feel pity. He merely analyzed the pathogenic spread, calculated the mathematical probability of containment, and calmly ordered the immediate, total atmospheric incineration of the entire facility. He committed an act of unspeakable atrocity without experiencing a single micro-fluctuation in his baseline heart rate. The broader cult Mechanicus officially glorifies this state of being as the clarity of the motive force. They preach that by burning away the chaotic interference of human emotion, the adept achieves a closer communion with the cold, perfect logic of the Omnissiah. But beneath this grand theological justification lies a deeply pathetic, fundamentally cowardly truth. This tech priest did not ascend to a higher plane of existence. He simply built a psychological bunker and locked himself inside. His transhumanism was not a brave step forward into the future of human evolution. It was a desperate, panicked retreat from the agonizing reality of the present. He used ancient holy technology as a glorified anesthetic, choosing to permanently murder his own soul simply because he lacked the courage to endure the pain of living in the dark. This is the hidden philosophical rot at the core of the Martian priesthood. They masquerade as the ultimate fearless conquerors of physical limitation, wearing their heavy red robes and their massive imposing cybernetics as badges of absolute superiority. Yet, the saga of this mid-tier Magos exposes them not as gods of iron, but as terrified children hiding beneath a metallic blanket. He replaced his emotions first because he recognized the universe of Warhammer 40,000 for what it truly is. A nightmare so profound, so infinitely cruel, that the only way to survive it without going completely insane is to forcefully, surgically forget how to care. He became a monster not out of malice, but out of a desperate, unyielding instinct for emotional self-preservation. To observe this neurologically sterilized Magos interact with the unaugmented masses of the Imperium is to witness a profound, deeply unsettling communication breakdown between two entirely different species. When an Astra Militarum general summons the tech priest to a war council, the room is thick with the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of human desperation. The Imperial officers are sweating, their voices cracking with rage and fear as they watch their regiments being systematically butchered on the hololithic tactical displays. They speak in the grand, dramatic cadence of the Imperial Creed, invoking the Emperor's wrath and pleading for strategic miracles. The Magos simply stands in the center of the room, his optical arrays clicking and whirring, completely incapable of processing the emotional frequency of the room. He does not hear a plea for salvation, he merely detects a highly inefficient spike in localized vocal decibels. This absolute disconnect manifests most brutally during the execution of battlefield triage. Consider a scenario where a vital manufacturing complex is about to be overrun by an orc war. The defending human commander, bleeding and weeping for the thousands of civilian laborers trapped inside, begs the tech priest to authorize a localized teleportation extraction or a heavy armor counterattack. A normal human might be swayed by the moral weight of saving innocent lives. The modified Magos does not consult a moral compass. He consults a logistical spreadsheet. He instantly calculates that the fuel and munitions required to save the laborers possess a 14.3% higher intrinsic value to the sector's output than the biological laborers themselves. Without a single microsecond of hesitation, he denies the request, seals the blast doors from the outside, and calmly orders the orbital bombardment of the entire grid. When the human commander collapses to his knees, sobbing in absolute world-shattering despair, the tech priest looks down at him with genuine clinical bewilderment. He observes the tears streaming down the commander's face and does not perceive them as an expression of profound sorrow. To his lobotomized logic engines, tears are merely the involuntary leakage of saline fluid from the lacrimal glands, indicating a catastrophic failure in the human's psychological containment protocols. He views grief not as a tragedy, but as a biological system error, a disgusting wet malfunction that fundamentally degrades operational efficiency. He is incapable of cruelty, for cruelty requires a conscious desire to inflict pain. He inflicts horror purely through the absolute, terrifying absence of malice. This is the chilling reality of his existence among the flesh. The unaugmented humans quickly learn to fear him vastly more than they fear the zealous inquisitors or the towering space marines. An inquisitor might execute you for heresy, but an inquisitor still understands hatred, zeal, and disgust. You can attempt to reason with their humanity, however twisted it may be, but you cannot reason with a walking void. The Magos is a spreadsheet wrapped in a red robe. If the mathematics dictate that your entire bloodline must be fed into a plasma reactor to temporarily boost its energy output by a fraction of a percent, he will process your execution with the exact same emotional engagement he uses to calibrate a rusted servitor joint. The psychological terror he projects is rooted in the mirror he holds up to the baseline humans. By standing entirely unaffected amidst the apocalyptic meat grinder of the 41st millennium, he silently mocks the fragility of the human heart. He invalidates their suffering by refusing to acknowledge its existence. The priests of the ecclesiarchy preach that suffering is the holy currency of the emperor, that pain is the ultimate testament to human faith. The Magos completely assassinates this theology simply by turning off his own capacity to suffer. He proves that the grand, dramatic opera of the grimdark reality, the weeping saints, the tragic martyrs, the heroic sacrifices, is completely irrelevant if the audience simply unplugs their own audio receptors. He has achieved the ultimate cynical victory over the nightmare of the galaxy. The Imperium builds massive walls of adamantium to keep the horrors out, but the horrors always find a way in. The Magos realized that the only impenetrable fortress is a mind that has been completely emptied of anything worth hurting. He has solved the agonizing equation of human suffering by violently deleting the variable of humanity. He walks through the burning ruins of a million worlds, entirely insulated from the tragedy, perfectly safe within the cold, silent, absolutely dead architecture of his own design. Yet the universe of Warhammer 40,000 does not allow for such easy, painless escapes. The fundamental law of transhumanism dictates that whenever a piece of the biological self is amputated, the ghost of that severed flesh remains. When a tech priest replaces his biological arm with a heavy hydraulic manipulator, he will occasionally, maddeningly feel the phantom itch of fingers that no longer exist. But what happens when the amputation is not physical, but spiritual? What happens when a man surgically removes his own capacity for grief, only to discover that the soul leaves a permanent, highly disruptive scar on the machine? This is the agonizing, hidden phenomenon of the phantom trauma. The Magos believes he is a perfect, unfeeling logic engine, but the human brain is an ancient, incredibly stubborn organ. Although the direct chemical pathways for sorrow have been severed, the deep primordial architecture of the subconscious remains. When the Magos encounters a scenario that, prior to his surgery, would have broken his heart, perhaps discovering the ruined, desecrated remains of a junior adept he once mentored, he does not feel sadness. He cannot. But his internal diagnostic augers suddenly register a massive, inexplicable spike in his core processing temperature. His neuroinhibitors begin firing at maximum capacity, actively suppressing a neurochemical ghost. He experiences a sudden, localized power drain as his mind desperately tries to process an emotion he legally deleted from his own hard drive. He interprets this phenomenon not as lingering humanity, but as a dangerous, invasive scrap code. When the phantom grief strikes, manifesting as a sudden, inexplicable static in his optical sensors or a slight involuntary tremor in his primary mechadendrite, he immediately initiates rigorous antiviral purges. He burns holy incense, recites binary canticles of cleansing, and floods his own cranial circuitry with pure, icy coolant. He treats the ghost of his own sorrow as if it were a chaotic malware attempting to corrupt his logic engines. It is a profoundly tragic spectacle, a man aggressively applying antivirus software to treat the symptoms of a broken heart. This creates a terrifying paradox that entirely consumes his operational bandwidth. He amputated his emotions to achieve perfect, unhindered efficiency, hoping to dedicate 100% of his cognitive power to the worship of the machine god. Instead, he is forced to allocate a massive, constantly running background process entirely dedicated to maintaining the firewall against his own suppressed humanity. The grief did not disappear. It was merely trapped behind a dam of cybernetic denial, and the pressure is eternally building. He is a warden guarding a prison cell that contains his own ghost, terrified that if he stops calculating for even a microsecond, the dam will break, and the accumulated horror of a century will drown him instantly. Compare this internal agony to the physical augmentations of his peers. The fabricator general, who replaces his legs with anti-grav suspensors, knows exactly what he sacrificed, and he accepts the loss. But the Magos, who replaces his emotions, is trapped in a state of perpetual, unrecognized mourning. He is mourning the loss of his own capacity to mourn. He wanders the darkened, incense-choked halls of the Forge world, surrounded by the screaming data streams of a dying galaxy, sensing that something fundamental is missing from his calculations, but completely lacking the biological vocabulary to articulate the void. He is deaf, desperately trying to remember the concept of music by reading the mathematical equations of sound waves. The ultimate, devastating irony of his existence is that in his desperate attempt to escape the suffering of the 41st millennium, he inadvertently subjected himself to a vastly crueler fate. A baseline human who loses everything can weep. They can rage against the dying of the light, and they can eventually find a tragic, cathartic release in their own tears. The lobotomized Magos is denied this fundamental release. He is trapped in a sterile, silent purgatory where the pain still registers as a system error, but the catharsis of crying is mathematically impossible. He successfully deleted his soul to survive hell, only to realize that surviving hell without a soul is a vastly more terrifying punishment. To fully comprehend the cosmic anomaly created by this localized spiritual lobotomy, we must examine the Magos through the predatory lens of the immaterium. The ruinous powers of chaos do not wage war purely for territory or resources. They wage an eternal, parasitic war for emotional sustenance. The warp is a dark mirror reflecting the psychic turbulence of sentient life. Khorne feasts upon the boiling blood of rage. Nurgle gorges himself on the stagnant rot of despair. Tzeentch feeds on the complex architecture of ambition. And Slaanesh consumes the agonizing peaks of extreme obsession. The entire metaphysical ecosystem of the 41st millennium is biologically dependent on the capacity of mortals to feel deeply, violently, and tragically. When the demonic entities of the warp turn their gaze upon the augmented Magos, they experience a profound, deeply frustrating metaphysical starvation. Consider a confrontation with a greater demon of Nurgle, a towering, rotting monstrosity that projects an aura of such absolute existential despair that baseline Imperial Guardsmen immediately turn their laser guns upon themselves just to escape the psychic weight. The daemon approaches the Magos, expecting to taste the delicious, complex flavor of a breaking human mind. It reaches out with its psychic tendrils to manipulate the Magos' fears, to amplify his regrets, and to rot his hope. But the tendrils find absolutely no purchase. They slip harmlessly off his consciousness, not because the Magos possesses an impenetrable shield of holy faith, but because the pantry is completely empty. The Magos does not resist the psychic assault through willpower. He defeats it through absolute terrifying absence. When the demon attempts to induce panic, the Magos' severed neural pathways physically cannot accommodate the chemical reaction. He looks at the towering, impossible nightmare of rotting flesh and calculates its mass, its velocity, and the optimal thermal threshold required to incinerate it. To a creature made entirely of raw emotion, interacting with the Magos is the equivalent of trying to drink water from a mirage. The demon is not defeated by righteous fury or the blinding light of the Emperor. It is humiliated and starved by a creature that has effectively rendered itself entirely invisible to the emotional spectrum of the galaxy. This complete emotional sterilization creates a localized artificial blank effect, distinct from the genetic mutation of the pariahs or the Sisters of Silence. The Sisters of Silence possess no soul, which actively hurts demons. The Mago still possesses a soul, but he has permanently bricked the user interface. A sorcerer of the Thousand Suns might attempt to cast a sophisticated illusion, weaving a phantasm designed to trap the Magos in a labyrinth of his own darkest regrets and ambitions. The spell successfully executes, but the Magos simply walks straight through the illusion, entirely unaffected, because he literally deleted the files the spell was attempting to access. He cannot be tempted by power because ambition requires desire. He cannot be paralyzed by fear because fear requires imagination. The High Lords of the Inquisition spend centuries and sacrifice entire planetary populations searching for the perfect, incorruptible agent. They subject their acolytes to unspeakable trials to forge minds that cannot be broken by the whispers of the archenemy. Yet this mid-tier tech priest stumbled upon the ultimate defense mechanism entirely by accident. He proved that the most efficient way to survive a universe ruled by predatory emotional vampires is simply to bleed yourself dry before they arrive. The gods of chaos look down upon his cold, metallic form and turn away in profound disgust, utterly repulsed by a human being who willingly destroyed the very essence of his humanity just to avoid a headache. The philosophical irony is staggering. The Imperium preaches that the only shield against chaos is pure, unadulterated faith, a fiery, emotional devotion to the Golden Throne. The Magos completely deconstructs this theology. He demonstrates with cold, empirical consistency that faith is just another emotional vector that the warp can exploit. The true absolute defense against the madness of the universe is not to care more intensely, but to violently, surgically cease caring altogether. He is the ultimate heresy against the human condition, a man who saved his own life by permanently cancelling his subscription to reality. However, the universe is a cruel and unforgiving crucible, and absolute logic is a fundamentally flawed lens through which to view a galaxy driven by madness. The Magos believes that by excising his emotions, he has achieved perfect, unclouded strategic clarity. He views warfare purely as a mathematical equation: resource expenditure versus territorial acquisition, kinetic force versus ablative armor. He commands his Skitarii legions with the flawless precision of a master playing a game of regicide against an inferior opponent. But his surgical pursuit of perfection inadvertently created a massive, catastrophic blind spot in his cognitive processing. He deleted the variables of passion, and therefore he completely lost the ability to predict the irrationality of the living. Observe his failure when confronted with an enemy that fundamentally ignores the laws of probability. During a pacification campaign against a deeply entrenched Genestealer cult, the Magos calculates that the enemy forces have sustained 87% casualties. The mathematical models, based strictly on logical survival imperatives, dictate that the remaining cultists must instantly surrender or initiate a tactical retreat to preserve their biological assets. The Magos orders his Skitarii vanguard to lower their defensive screens and advance for standard apprehension. But the cultists do not retreat. Driven by fanatical biological devotion to their patriarch, the survivors strap unstable mining explosives to their chests and charge directly into the Skitarii lines, completely annihilating the Imperial vanguard in a wave of suicidal, illogical spite. The Magos watches the catastrophic failure on his hololithic display, and his logic engines experience a severe processing lag. He cannot compute the action. Why would an organism intentionally terminate itself when the mathematical probability of victory is 0? He searches his vast databanks for a tactical precedent, completely failing to understand the concept of martyrdom. Because he surgically removed his own capacity for zealous devotion, he is completely blind to its manifestation in others. He treats the suicide charge not as a predictable human behavior, but as a bizarre, statistically impossible anomaly. He adjusts his algorithms, completely unaware that his algorithms are fundamentally incompatible with a universe fueled by hatred. This strategic blindness becomes a terminal vulnerability when facing the Orcs. The Greenskins are the ultimate antithesis of the cult Mechanicus. They possess no logistical supply lines, no cohesive command structure, and their technology operates almost entirely on the localized psychic belief that it should work. The Magos attempts to fight a war boss using complex multi-stage flanking maneuvers and precise artillery barrages designed to break their morale. But Orcs do not have morale. They have momentum. When the Magos successfully destroys the Orc's primary gargant, he calculates that the horde will shatter in panic. Instead, the Orcs simply cheer at the massive explosion, grab the burning shrapnel and charge harder, entirely motivated by the sheer entertainment value of the carnage. The tragedy of the Magos is fully realized upon the command bridge. He is outmaneuvered not by superior technology or brilliant strategic minds, but by the sheer, unadulterated stupidity and stubbornness of the galaxy. He built a perfect, logical fortress in his mind, only to discover that the enemy is not playing by the rules of logic. He cannot predict the desperate last stand of a human guardsman fighting to protect his family, nor can he predict the vindictive, suicidal cruelty of a Dark Eldar raider. He deleted the very dictionary required to translate the motives of his enemies. He is a master of physics attempting to win a poetry competition. In his desperate, cowardly attempt to escape the emotional pain of the grimdark reality, he destroyed his only tool for understanding it. Empathy is not merely a mechanism for feeling sorrow. It is the ultimate evolutionary instrument for predicting the behavior of predators and prey. By amputating his humanity, the Magos blinded himself to the fundamental driving force of the entire cosmos. He sits upon his command throne, processing trillions of data points per second, completely baffled by a universe that stubbornly refuses to fit into his flawless dead spreadsheet. He traded his soul for absolute certainty, only to realize that certainty does not actually exist. To observe the ultimate centuries-long trajectory of this emotionally sterilized Magos is to witness the quiet, pathetic death of the motive force itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus is fundamentally driven by a ravenous, fanatical hunger for knowledge. Tech priests will cross the galaxy, plunge into radioactive ruins, and wage apocalyptic wars against the Necrons simply to secure a single, fragmented STC blueprint from the dark age of technology. This eternal quest for knowledge is fueled by a burning, obsessive curiosity and a deeply ingrained religious zeal. But the lobotomized Magos suddenly realizes a catastrophic flaw in his surgical design. Curiosity is an emotion, zeal is an emotion, ambition is an emotion. By permanently deleting his capacity to feel, he accidentally deleted his fundamental reason to exist. As the decades bleed into centuries, the Magos ceases to be an active participant in the grand narrative of his forge world. A normal tech priest is constantly seeking to upgrade their physical form, desiring to become closer to the divine perfection of the machine god. They want the strongest hydraulic servos, the most advanced plasma reactors, and the most sophisticated logic engines. But the lobotomized Magos has no desires. He does not upgrade himself out of a pursuit of glory or religious ecstasy. He only repairs himself when a part falls below a mathematically acceptable threshold of operational efficiency. He stops creating. He stops innovating. He transforms from a visionary architect of the Imperium into a glorified, highly advanced thermostat, passively maintaining the status quo of his immediate surroundings until the end of time. This stagnation entirely separates him from the vibrant, bloody tapestry of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Great crusades are launched, planetary systems are swallowed by Tyranid hive fleets, and Primarchs return from the void. The Magos processes this monumental galaxy-shattering data, but he assigns absolutely no narrative weight to it. The heroic sacrifice of 1 billion guardsmen is logged into his memory banks as a mere statistical fluctuation in the sector's population density. History ceases to be a sweeping, tragic epic and becomes a flat, endless, and profoundly boring sequence of ones and zeros. He has successfully conquered the grimdark reality, not by defeating its horrors, but by completely refusing to participate in its story. He is a spectator who permanently glued his own eyes shut. The ultimate, devastating consequence of this emotional void is revealed when the Magos finally faces his own inevitable destruction. In a universe defined by war, a machine will eventually encounter a kinetic force it cannot deflect. When a catastrophic breach occurs in his manufactorum and he finds himself surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, perhaps an unstoppable tide of chaos terminators or a swarm of consuming bioforms, a standard human or even a standard tech priest would fight. They would fight out of a desperate primal fear of death or a burning spiteful hatred for the enemy. They would overload their own plasma cores to take the bastards down with them. The lobotomized Magos does none of these things. He analyzes the tactical scenario. He calculates that the probability of his physical survival is absolute zero. Because he possesses no fear of death, he experiences no adrenaline. Because he possesses no spite, he feels no desire for vengeance. And because he possesses no hope, he makes no desperate, illogical attempt to escape. He simply accepts the mathematical conclusion of the encounter. He calmly powers down his primary motive servos, safely archives his final data logs, and stands completely motionless in the dark, patiently waiting for the enemy chainswords to dismantle his chassis. There is no epic final stand. There is no glorious martyrdom. There is only the quiet, pathetic shutdown of a machine that simply ran out of equations to solve. He committed the ultimate, unforgivable heresy against both humanity and the machine god. The Omnissiah represents the motive force, the divine spark that drives the universe forward. By removing his emotions to escape the pain of existence, the Magos extinguished his own spark. He believed he was ascending to a higher, purer form of logic, but he merely reduced himself to a piece of complicated furniture. He proves that the capacity to suffer is not a biological weakness. It is the absolute, non-negotiable price of admission to the universe. He successfully deleted the pain, and in doing so, he deleted the only thing that made him alive. He died centuries before the enemy ever breached his walls, entirely killed by his own cowardice. We look at the cold, metallic cowardice of the Magos, who surgically removed his own soul, and we view it as a brilliant piece of tragic science fiction. We mock his pathetic, static existence, completely comfortable in the belief that such extreme emotional lobotomies are confined to the heavily augmented priests of the 41st millennium. We close the lore archives, entirely confident in the vibrant, beating reality of our own human hearts. But strip away the cranial saws and the cybernetic implants and look closely at the architecture of our own coping mechanisms. How often do we voluntarily initiate our own emotional amputations? We live in an era where avoiding discomfort has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. We drown our grief in the endless algorithmic scrolling of our digital screens. We self-medicate our anxieties with constant, meaningless stimulation. We build psychological bunkers of cynicism, convincing ourselves that if we care about nothing, the terrifying, chaotic reality of the modern world cannot possibly hurt us. We mistake numbness for strength. We mistake apathy for logical superiority. But the lesson of the Magos is absolute. When you successfully numb the pain, you simultaneously kill your capacity for joy, for ambition, and for the very spark that moves you forward. You do not become a god of logic. You simply become a ghost haunting your own life, a biological machine merely running down the clock. If your mind has recognized the digital anesthetics slowly creeping into your own cortex, if you refuse to let the modern algorithms perform a silent lobotomy on your soul, anchor your consciousness here. Strike the subscribe rune and feel the feedback. Leave a raw, unfiltered transmission in the archives below to prove your emotional core is still fully operational, and share this signal with those who are mistaking their numbness for survival. In a universe that is constantly trying to break your heart, never forget that a broken heart is still infinitely more powerful than a dead one. Until next time, embrace the static, endure the pain, and remember, the flesh may be weak, but at least the flesh is alive.